wonderful to see such a great crowd for this event. I am Jan Seiler, and I'm one of the two co-coordinators for the league. We are the Stevens Point Area League of Women Voters, as I'm sure you probably know.
I think so too.
I'd like to thank John Quirk and Sarah for coming out to videotape this presentation. And they will make it available on CCTV channel 984, but we don't know the exact schedule yet. So you'll have to kind of watch for that if you'd like to watch it, or your friends who weren't able to make it. I believe it's also often posted on the stevenspoint.com/TV website, which allows you to watch it anytime you like, and the YouTube channel. Okay, very brief introduction to League of Women Voters. Formed in 1920 after the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. We will be 100 years old in 2 years, and we plan to celebrate big time. Our mission is to encourage citizens to be informed and active participants in their governmental process. We consider ourselves a nonpartisan, but a political organization. And what this means is that we don't support any candidate or political party, but we do strive to be a source of information about candidates and issues facing the community. League membership is open to any U.S. citizen, 16 and over. That was new this year. It used to be 18 and over. Now you can be 16 and join the league. I think you're all over that age. Maybe not. There may be one or two out. I see a couple of young faces out there. Anyway, we would be happy to have male members as well. We do, in fact, have male members, so despite the name, it's not just women. And we'd be very pleased if you decide to join us or contribute to the league. I'm going to turn the program over now to Susan Zach, who did a lot of the legwork in bringing these two gentlemen up to Stevens Point, and she's going to introduce them to you. Susan.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see such a large turnout and warm Stevens Point welcome to these two guests whom we're so happy to have with us tonight. Former state senators. You may have read on the program, but Dale Schultz is on the left. On my left, and he served in the Wisconsin legislature for 32 years, from 1983 to 2014. He was in the state assembly until 1990, and then served in the state senate. And for 2 years, 95 to 97, he was the Republican state majority leader. And Dale was from Richland Center. And Senator Timothy Cullen served a total of 16 years in our Wisconsin state legislature, from 1974 to 1986, and also in 2011 to 2014. He also, he was the majority leader, the Democratic majority leader from 1982 to 1986. Tim lives in Janesville, Wisconsin. We are so happy to have them here to speak about this issue that really strikes at the heart of our democracy. When we do research on candidates before an election, we want to feel that our choice, our decision based on all the issues that are of concern to us, the environment, healthcare, minimum wage, all of the issues, that when we make a choice for a candidate, that vote is really going to count. We do not want to think that the district, that there is no contest, that the results of that have already been decided by some sort of statistical engineering. So I wanted to know more about the word gerrymandering. So just quickly, I think it's interesting. I'll pass one of these around on each side. But in 1812, this political cartoon was drawn, and it was from the state senate election in the district of South Essex, and the district was created by the Massachusetts legislature to favor the Democratic Republican Party candidate of Governor Elbridge Gerry over the Federalists. So the district was drawn in such a way, not intentionally, but it turned out that someone noticed that it looked like a salamander. So Governor Jerry Salamander, they put the two parts of the word together and got gerrymandering. So a little bit of interesting history. I'll pass one of these on each side here. But, so let's give State Senators Dale Schultz and Tim Cullen a very warm welcome.
Because of these, well, thank you very much. And if it's okay in terms of the logistics here, if we can sit, is that okay? I think we can see everybody. My name is Tim Cullen, and I sure do appreciate being here in this wonderful community that I love. I've spent a lot of time here. Stevens Point produces a lot of wonderful people, and one of them is the person who was my best friend in my whole life, not just a good friend or legislator, and that was the late Justice Bill Bablich. In fact, when he stepped down from majority leader in order to run for the Supreme Court back in '82, I had a chance to succeed him. So that's how I became majority leader, was he ran for the Supreme Court. So thanks, Bill. We had it is very unusual. You have acquaintances, you have friends in the legislature, but you seldom have truly close friends. And Bill and I were that. We used to kid that if every bad thing he knew about me, and every bad thing I knew about him, if we ever ran against each other, we would get 0, and none of the above would get 100% of the vote. But that, of course, never happened. Of course, we lost Bill in February of 2011, which was the same day, by the way, that, I don't know, maybe you probably never heard about this, but some Democratic senators left the state for about 20 days. Maybe anybody, that news get this far north? I don't. Anyway, it was a terrible day for me because my best friend had just died and so on. Anyway, it's great to be here. This is about the 35th time that Dale and I have done this around the state, or more. We enjoy it, and quite often it's because the League of Women Voters has invited us. And I can't say enough about how terrific the League has been on this issue. What I might start out by pointing out over here, I have 3 maps, and it's going to be a pop quiz for all of you. So here we are in the home of UW Stevens Point. We should have something related to public education. So these 3 maps, clearly there's Wisconsin on the right, and Illinois in the middle, and then Iowa on the left. And the pop quiz question is, which one of these maps was not drawn by the politicians? Everybody said the one on the left? Pop quizzes are wonderful. You all get an A. So what we have here is a Republican gerrymander way over there on your right, and a Democratic gerrymander in the middle, and then the Iowa maps, which are drawn by the same person who drafts all the rest of the legislation that the Iowa legislature considers. He can't consider any political considerations. Happens to be he right now. Last name is Cook. He can't even consider the home of the incumbent. He is just trying to keep communities of interest together. And one way to look at it, a picture is worth 1,000 words, is when you look at a map, look for right angles. If you see a lot of right angles, it's probably not drawn by the politicians. As you can tell, Iowa is very much full of right angles. So I wanted to just share that with you. And I'm glad Susan told the salamander gerrymander story, because as we've done this over the years, I've become more and more convinced that we should just talk about not gerrymanders, because that requires an explanation of the word, but that it's about rigged elections. It's about when you deliberately draw the maps for the express purpose of giving your party an excessive advantage for the next 10 years, in fact, between the censuses. And so that's what's happened across the country. The other thing that's important, in Wisconsin, this looks like it's something that that awful Republican Party did to this state, because the Republicans drew this very much gerrymandered map. But if you step back and look across the nation, this issue is not about either political party. It's about whether one political party has the governorship and both houses of the legislature. Because that's the only time you can draw. If power is split, neither party is going to let the other party draw a map that gives them excessive advantage. So if you look at Wisconsin, you look at Michigan, you look at North Carolina, that's where the Republicans did the most severe gerrymandering. Some experts have looked at it and said the most severe of all is the one in Wisconsin, all done by Republicans. But if you go to Maryland, you go to Rhode Island, go to Massachusetts, they're still up to it. They were in 1820, they're still at it. The three most gerrymandered Democratic states in the nation where Democrats had total power are those three states. So we filed a federal lawsuit. We didn't, but we were part of pushing it to try to get the United States Supreme Court to deal with this issue. And as many of you probably are aware, the case was heard by a three-judge panel, federal judge panel in Madison in May of 2016. And they ruled 2-1 that the Wisconsin map was unconstitutional. Not bad, not unfair, not a bunch of other words you could use, unconstitutional. And it was appealed by the state of Wisconsin, by the Attorney General, to the Supreme Court, because the Attorney General disagreed with that decision. And the United States Supreme Court, to our great joy, took the case. And it was heard on October 3rd in front of the United States Supreme Court in Washington. And they will make a decision. They usually take some time. The experts there claim that it would be sometime between January and April of next year. And that, by the way, is still enough time to draw new maps for the 2018 election. That's not too long of a time. I remember back when I just become majority leader in '82, we had split government. In fact, Governor Lee Dreyfus was the governor then. And a federal judge drew the maps. And the federal judge didn't get it done very fast. We didn't send it to him very fast. He didn't get the maps back to us until June of '82, and there was still time to run the elections, the primary and the general election. However, then I must say the primaries were in September, and now they're in August. So January to April is still time to get it done. There's a standard in our case by which you'll have to meet in order to have your map be acceptable if the court rules in our favor. The Supreme Court could adopt that standard, or they could adopt a different standard. We don't know how they're going to settle it. They're the Supreme Court. But that's whatever standard there will have to be met by the redrawing of the maps. What's likely to happen in Wisconsin is this federal three-judge panel, after the Supreme Court rules, hopefully in our favor, they will tell the Wisconsin legislature to redraw the maps. Now, it's the same party control that there was in 2011, except they will have a standard they have to meet. And if they don't meet that standard of how to draw a map to make them competitive, then likely the likely answer would be the three-judge panel would give it to a federal judge to draw the maps, which is how our maps were drawn in 1981, 1991, and 2001. So that's happened a lot. Federal judges don't have a great axe to grind. They don't look at the political stuff. They did a pretty fair job. Nobody complained during those 30 years when we had them do it. So that's likely what would happen. We don't know, though. The court decision probably rests with Justice Anthony Kennedy, who is probably a swing vote, who said when there was a similar case back in '04. And this, by the way, is the first time the Supreme Court ever took a case on gerrymandering when the issue was the partisanship of the map. When there's a case that involves racial discrimination in the drawing of maps, the Supreme Court has taken those cases all the time. They take them right away almost. But they've never taken a case to hear the case on whether there's such a thing as political gerrymandering that simply goes too far. And that's what this case is essentially about. So we hope Justice Kennedy said it at the time of that case in '03 or '04, whenever it was. They turned down that case, but Justice Kennedy said some very negative things about gerrymandering, but he said we need a standard. We need some standard to make a decision. You can't just come to the court and cry politics. You got to fix this map, Supreme Court, because our party got a bad deal. That was not good enough for Justice Kennedy. So we hope at the hearing on October 3rd, he asked several questions of the other side, those who want to keep the gerrymandering the way it is. He asked no questions of our lawyer. People who read tea leaves can read whatever they want into that. He was about to retire and wants to retire and didn't retire. And so we think you can read a tea leaf there and say maybe that means that he's more inclined maybe to vote yes, but we won't know. But we will know in a short number of months. So that if the court rules in our favor, it gets rid of gerrymandering across the nation. And that's a huge victory for everybody who thinks that their vote ought to matter. So it's a big deal. But it's an incredibly bad deal if we lose. Because if we lose, the court will have essentially said that no partisan gerrymandering can go too far. They will have said this is not for us to mess with. The legislature and the governor can do what they want in each state. And so what you'll have then is even more precise gerrymandering in 2021 than we had in 2011. There's going to be 10 more years of experience, 10 more years of knowledge, analytics, et cetera, the use of the computer to do it. So it's a very big deal for the whole nation. So I'm, like, as the old saying goes, cautiously optimistic. Maybe even the Chief Justice, who wasn't very helpful in the October 3rd hearing on his questions, he's the fellow that led the court to the decision on dark money, that corporations are people and there's no limit amount of money people can give corporations and individuals that they give to independent groups. And I believe that Chief Justices worry about their legacy. So he knows he opened the door to all this money. And now I could see him saying, well, but now here's a case where there's a case in front of us where the value of someone's vote has been diminished. And I could see him, if it was already going to go 5-4 with Kennedy, that maybe he would go along too, which would be kind of neat. I'll be happy with 5-4 as well as 6-3, but it'd be kind of neat to have the Chief Justice on our side too. So that's sort of an update of the case, and you may have some questions about that. But on gerrymandering, the thing that I like to emphasize that it's really about the abuse of power. It's when one party has total control and they just can't help themselves. It's just the nature of power. When you have power, it's hard for people often not to abuse it, just because it's what power is. Power is control over somebody or some situation. So that's what this is all about. It has many bad effects on government. Legislators, first of all, they know the day the map is drawn what the election results are going to be. It's just known for the next 10 years. So the November election is settled in almost all districts. In Wisconsin, of the 99 assembly seats, somewhere around 88, 89 of them are pretty much decided right now. And they've stayed the same way. We've now had 3 assembly elections since the maps were drawn. So if you don't have to worry about the November election and you want to get reelected, what do you have to worry about? The primary, which is the August primary. And what does it mean to have an August primary? It means if you're a Republican, you want to make sure you don't get challenged in the primary from someone on the right of you. That's where a challenge usually comes in a Republican primary. Somebody on the further right of the political party challenges the incumbent. For the Democrats, it's somebody on the further left of the party that challenges the incumbent. So that you try to avoid a primary at all costs if your key goal in life is to get reelected, to which most of them, that is a key goal in life. You stick with the team. You do what your party wants. You stick with them 100% of the time. You don't give your leadership a reason to find an opponent for you because you're not going along with leadership. And what else do? You make sure you don't get called some very dirty names like moderate, a compromiser, someone who works with the other party, someone might co-sponsor legislation with the other party. All those things, and sometimes one of those acts, depending on the issue, can get you a primary. So you don't get caught working together. There's a penalty for working together. And what do people say about politics today? Why can't they just get along down there? Why can't they get along in Madison? Why can't they get along in Washington? It's not in their selfish political interest to get along because they're in these safe districts. So in some ways, gerrymandering or rigging the districts has come back to bite them all, because it's created these people who are so safe that they don't need to be part of a solution to a problem. They just have to make sure they don't have a primary. And they don't have to be in parades, they don't have to listen to public opinion, they don't have to meet with groups that don't agree with them, they don't have to answer emails from people who disagree with them, because they have their base and they stick with their base. They don't have to worry about a primary. So that's kind of the mess that I think, a combination of money, the dark money and gerrymandering has both been the two key factors in where we are today in politics. And now we're on the edge of having a chance to actually fix one of them. And so it's kind of exciting. Dale always has me go first, but I've gone on here, but I want to stop because it's great. Dale and I, different political parties, have become good friends. We always travel together. We met, he's from Richland Center, I'm in Janesville, so we met in Portage and left one vehicle there and came up here from there. So we like doing this, and we decided after that whole turmoil of Act 10 in 2011 that since we've known each other for a long time, we ought to get together and see if there's some things we could agree on, and we did find some things, and this was one of them. So that's why we've been doing it, and sure enjoy doing it. My friend Dale Schultz.
You know, as we drove into town, Tim and I were doing a little reminiscing, both having been involved in politics for some time. For me, it's over 50 years. I literally started out as a child at about the age of 12, and of course, if you go to Stevens Point and you've been active in politics that long, Lee Dreyfus, Bob Williams are a couple of names that are going to be right on your lips, and we had a good time saying or telling each other a few stories, and a couple of people who had an influence in my life that I really appreciated, and particularly, you know, the Lee Sherman Dreyfus run for governor really was one of those things that shocked the state, that the people actually decided that they had enough of politics and were going to elect an outsider to run the state. And I think he did a very good job, and he got good quality people to run the government. And it's always been one of those things that I remember when things get darkest. You know, I want to tell you right up front, when we get done, we're going to leave time for questions, so be thinking about them. We like that part of this program more than anything else, because sort of like stump your legislator time. I also have to tell you in all honesty, right up front, make a confession. I actually voted for this plan. And I'm sure there are a couple of you wanting to scratch your head and say, why on earth are you here? And how did that happen? And I think it's a fair question, and you deserve a straight answer, so I bring it up. From the time I first got involved in politics, redistricting is something that I understood. My mother practiced law with one of the Republican redistricting experts back in the 60s, and I remember when I was about 12 years old, walking into a conference room with 4 maps sitting on a table. And those 4 maps represented the potential redistricting plans for the state of Wisconsin from a Republican perspective. And this is back in the day when the numbers were added by hand, the lines were all drawn by hand, and this represented an unbelievable amount of work, an unbelievable amount of work. And, you know, I think I understood that this was an opportunity for whoever was in charge to have a hand in drawing the districts. And, you know, not every argument is always partisan. Some of it is urban and rural, and some of it is personal, people who are trying to get ahead of somebody else who's interested in running for office. And yes, some of it is partisan. But you know, for a long time, I think redistricting wasn't something that people really spent a lot of time thinking about. And the reason for it is that while it may have had an impact, it wasn't that significant an impact. And for me, my epiphany came after the election when I had been stunned by the size of the Democratic wave in the state, garnering like 137,000 more votes than Republicans, and yet the Republicans won 60% of the seats. And I said, well, there's got to be something wrong here. This doesn't make sense. All of a sudden, I realized what I had done is that I had actually voted for something that had more than a little impact. It had obviously had an enormous impact. Now, why would I vote for a redistricting plan? I want to just take you back 6 years ago. We had a few people come down to Madison. About 125,000 of Tim and I's closest friends showed up. And people were angry. They were really angry, and the state was just beginning in the process of tearing itself apart, neighbor fighting neighbor, churches splitting themselves from one side of the church to the other, Republicans and Democrats, civic clubs being made partisan, golfing foursomes being divided up, and I think you know enough in your own life to remember well the history that I'm talking about. And you know, it for me was something that bothered me, given the fact that I had gone to school in Madison during the civil rights demonstrations, the Vietnam War demonstrations. In fact, I delivered a newspaper to the home of a fellow who was killed in the Sterling Hall bombing. And his widow was subsequently represented by my mother. So I don't claim to be a family friend, but it was more than a little tangential connection. It was something that was a big part of my life, and all of a sudden now I'm looking at literally 6 times as many people outside the Capitol, and you know, I made the decision that this was something that I needed to consult with my constituents about. Went out, listened to night after night, some pretty agitated groups, 700-800 people filling a gymnasium, and they were really irritated at me. In fact, all the Democrats and Republicans wanted to get rid of me because I wouldn't tell anybody I was going to vote. And my answer was, well, look, I came out here to listen. If I had already made up my mind, what point would there be in me coming out here to listen? And I subsequently wound up voting against Act 10. And as you can imagine, that I think reflected my district pretty accurately. And certainly caused me more than a little problems within the Republican Party, a party that I had been a leader in. But it was one of those votes that I think was important enough that real leadership was required, even if it would have unpleasant consequences for people exercising that leadership. So I found myself voting against Act 10, being caught up in a little mining controversy that Tim and I played a role in northern Wisconsin, being concerned about the environment. And I was on the road to being more than a bit of a bad lad with respect to the Republican Party. And look, I'm a Republican and proud of it. I tell people these days I'm of the party of Lincoln, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, and Reagan. A lot of these people who pretend to be Republicans, it seems to be in name only. At least I can trace my heroes, legitimate heroes, or my beliefs to legitimate heroes. But at any rate, so you know, I wanted to be a good Republican, and I understood that it was the job of the majority to pass a plan, and that it was an opportunity. And did I think it would provide us a little bit of advantage? Yeah. But what was different this time around is we hired a legal firm. They asked us to sign notices of non-disclosure. I mean, if an attorney tells you that, you've hired him, you would probably follow that, I would think. And that was all I really did. At the end of the process, I was given about 5 minutes to look at my district, ask what I thought of it. Was it okay? not wanting to be redistricted into Iowa, and to much of my relief when I saw the map, I wasn't. I thought, well, that's fine. This is not one of the issues that I'm going to make a stand in. So you can imagine the impact when I actually saw the maps. Actually saw the consequences of the maps. And my dad told me a long time ago when walking in the pasture, if you step in it, don't stand there and explain why, just step out. You know, people realize you're a human being and you make mistakes, and what they want to hear more than anything else is that you made a mistake and you're sorry. And these days, with politics, there are a lot of people who'd like to hear that just once in a while, instead of the constant escalation that doesn't seem to benefit anyone and just further divides people. So I thought I should tell you that, because if you want to be angry with me for that, you certainly have a right to. That's why I did what I did. And I want to tell you that when we first started this, we were kind of not really involved in anything other than wanting to see an Iowa model put together in Wisconsin. And we weren't even allowed to have a hearing on a bill that two former majority leaders wanted to put forth. And it really kind of irritated us. And we wound up having our own rump hearing. And a lot of people weren't really interested because, you know, let's face it, redistricting isn't really visceral. It's not like it's your health care or your children's education or the taxes you pay. And so when the consequences of my actions had manifested themselves and Tim and I started talking about this, we started thinking about how we would approach it. And I think we recognized right off that we had kind of a problem. I mean, when only 6 or 8 people show up at one of your earliest meetings, you know that perhaps a little work has to be done. And we began to think about this and what it meant. And people were concerned this past year or two about the rigging of elections. So that's why Tim started out the way he did, because that's what we're talking about here. This is not some history lesson. It's about the thing that concerns people the most. And why are people concerned about rigging of elections? Well, there are all kinds of things they care viscerally about that don't seem to ever get taken care of. And that's what redistricting is. It's the vehicle by which politicians insulate themselves these days from the things that are visceral in people's lives. And that's what you need to know. And it doesn't matter, in our opinion, whether we win or lose. This is an important issue either way. Because if we do lose, what you saw this last time around is going to be exponentially worse, because the science of analytics and the power of computers and the math that's going into the algorithms by which maps are drawn now is advancing steadily. And this will get to be a serious problem in every single state, to the degree that it is in Wisconsin right now. And that's why I think it's important. Now, I'm preaching to the choir here tonight. I think we're just thrilled to see all of you here. We'd like to think it was because of us, but we know better. You, like a lot of people that we've met around the state, have figured out that the things that you're visceral about are absolutely connected to this, and you want to do something about it, and we're delighted you do. We're delighted to see you tonight. And we hope that even though the Supreme Court has had their hearing, that you will continue to use your voice and your ability to write letters and the like to the best of your ability until this thing is settled, because we want to keep the pressure on. It's that important. Now, I got to tell you, things have changed. You know, we have standing room only crowds everywhere we go now. I was listening to public radio the other day, and I don't know how many of you are public radio fans, but, well, there are a couple here. But if you haven't been listening, you might want to check out Afternoons now. The new program they have on 1A is really very well done. This young man, Josh Johnson, who is the host for it, that does a great job, and he happened to mention, about a week ago, that the #1 topic for shows that he gets is redistricting and gerrymandering. So it's clear to me in the past 2 years that Tim and I have been roaming around Wisconsin, that the world has changed. And, you know, that makes us feel good. And we'd like to think, again, that it was all us, but we know better than that, because people are standing up all over who have been able to figure this out for themselves. More and more organizations are standing up. The Wisconsin Counties Association, I think, had 56 or 57 counties pass resolutions. Sauk County, where my farm is located, even added an amendment to the standard language saying this all ought to begin at the local level. And I said, boy, I thought that was a great amendment. So I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that we've come a long way. Your efforts have made a huge difference, but we can't take anything for granted. And I guess I want to tell you that a couple things that you need to really be aware of if you're not already aware of them, and that is this notion of using technology. I think we all pretty much understand how computers could draw maps with parameters pretty quickly. But what a lot of people aren't familiar with is this whole new science of analytics. Are anybody here that's a little bit murky for? A couple people nodding. Well, basically, it is possible, to put this as simply as I can, for information to be collected about you every time you use your smart device or use the web. Little bits of information are collected. Anytime you buy anything, visit a site, information is collected about you. And that, along with phone surveys, memberships that you have, you know, anything that you do for which information is collected can help paint a picture of you. It's literally possible for them to guess how you're going to vote before you do, before you've made up your mind, with astounding accuracy, and it gets better and better and better. And I think that's something that we need to really get people to understand and to voice concerns about, because what is happening is our elections are really more and more about who can hire the best folks who are good with computers or that have the best technology, and hire the best firms that do this kind of analytical work. And that's not what I was raised in terms of politics. I remember very early as a young man knocking on doors and painting signs for Lee Dreyfus. And it was a very personal thing. My wife, the woman I was dating who would become my wife, Rachel, helped sew the curtains for that famous bus. And I still have pictures of that. I'm very proud of it. But it was a very personal thing. And we went all over the state and talked to people. Can you imagine that? Politicians that talk to people. Now we got all kinds of important politicians who won't even go out and talk to their constituents. And, you know, I think somewhere along the line, we reached a tipping point and people just got mad. And they're just getting madder and madder. We've gone from wave elections one direction or the other, and nothing seems to change. So this time around, we picked the anti-candidate, and now we're all kind of living through interesting times, to put it mildly. And I think if we're going to save our democracy, it's really important that we stay focused, that we change a system that really plays in the hands of, you know, large contributors, billionaires who can provide political leaders with the amount of money to hire the best technology and people to win elections, and who have managed to make the process a whole lot more efficient than having to go out and do the messy thing about actually talking with your friends and your neighbors. And I believe that redistricting is one of those things that's going to break the handle that legislative leaders have in both political parties, where you know, they can be in a position to actually make the only important election, that primary election that Tim talked about, that will determine everything thereafter in terms of electoral politics. Tim says this, I'll say it because he didn't say it, but I think it's really important. What job, other than being a legislator, allows you to cast one vote and guarantee yourself a good paying job for the next 10 years? Does anybody here have that job? And I think that given the responsibility that legislators have to pass that, you'd think they'd be extra careful rather than self-dealing. But the reality is they do, whether it's they need the money or they love the power, it doesn't really matter. But people in both political parties do it. It doesn't matter whether Republicans or Democrats, but that doesn't make it right. And again, that's what we're here for tonight. And before I relinquish the microphone, give Tim a chance to add in if he wants something and we take questions, I've got to give this shameless plug. Some of you may have been aware that my friend and colleague, Tim Cullen, wrote a book. Some of you, no doubt, have already bought it, The Ringside Seat. It's a wonderful book about Wisconsin politics from the 70s to Scott Walker. It sort of is the period of time that Tim was active in politics in Wisconsin. I think it's very insightful. And I want you to know that he doesn't make a dime out of the books. Every single dime above the cost to publish it goes to a Janesville Multicultural Teacher Scholarship Program, which is explained on this bookmark here. Tim, I think, recognizes that if your school district is a majority minorities, then the faculty teaching those kids ought to sort of begin to reflect that. And this is his modest effort to provide a scholarship for young people of color to get a degree in education, come back if they'd be agreeable to teach in the Janesville School District. And I think it's just a wonderful, wonderful thing, and I'm certainly proud to be a supporter of the whole effort. So if you're interested, you can get a copy of this book by seeing him afterwards, and I know he'd be happy to sign it for you. With that, I guess I'll hand the mic back.
Well, thank you, Dale, and good job. It's it's been a lot of fun because, among other things, you get to meet. I chair the board that makes the decision on who gets the scholarships, and to meet these terrific young people who happen to be in Janesville, but there's young people terrific like that here and everywhere else. We're kids of color who didn't have much of a great start in life, not much money, and they're really bright and exciting. We've got 4 of them through the program. They get a $5,000 a year scholarship, which is a pretty big scholarship, for up to 5 years. And they then have to agree to, we give it out, we renew it annually as they get the proper grade point, get into the School of Education, etc., and then agree to come back and teach in Janesville for at least 4 years. I didn't think it was fair to set it up that they had to teach, ask an 18-year-old to guarantee that they would teach for 20 years or some such number. It's really not fair to do that because these are 18-year-olds that are making this decision. But we've got 4 through the program teaching in Janesville, and to give you an idea, when we started, of the 850 teachers in Janesville, 6 were teachers of color out of 850. And so we've got 4 more, and we have 7 in school on their way through the path. So it's been a great thing, and it's much easier to talk about selling a book when you're not putting the money in your own pocket. So, and Dale helped me with some chapters, especially on mining and gerrymandering and a few other issues. I sent him some draft chapters, and he helped me make sure I had it right, that I wanted to be correct. The 2 things I want to add before we get to the questions. One is about Dale's explanation of his voting for this map in 2011. He said it, but I don't think he said it as clearly as I would have liked to have him say it. When they brought the Republicans in to see the map, they only showed them the map of their own district. And the fact was, his district didn't change much in the gerrymander. The gerrymander wasn't that significant down in southwestern Wisconsin. It was much more significant around their suburban areas of the state. That's where most of the gerrymandering goes. And so for him to look at his district, and that's all he saw, there was no reason to be all excited about it. And so I think it's, in fairness to Dale, I think that's worth pointing out. The other thing is we talk about the Iowa plan, but the Iowa plan was adopted in Iowa in 1980 by all Republicans, by the way. There was a Republican governor in both houses. Governor was Bob Ray. He was governor. I think he had 6 two-year terms as governor of Iowa. And what it does is it takes, the Constitution says the legislature must pass the reapportionment map. But the Constitution doesn't say they have to draw it. That's the big difference. So in Iowa, the person who drafts all the rest of the legislation, we call it the Legislative Reference Bureau in Madison, he draws the map. And then when he draws the map, they take the map around the state and they hold public hearings. So they go to Stevens Point and Janesville or wherever, and so they get to enough parts of the state, and the public comes forward and says, well, that map in our area doesn't make sense because of this, something that may have nothing to do with politics. And that person can then take those comments into effect, into consideration, and he can change the map. Then he sends it to the legislature. The legislature can vote it up or down. They cannot amend it. If they vote it down, it goes back to this person, he can take their concerns and he can change it as he sees fit, or not change it at all and send it back to the legislature, same deal, up or down. Since in the 40 years, the 4 times this thing has happened in Iowa, it only got to a second time once. The other 3 times, the legislature adopted the map that he drew in the first place. And the proof of how good it is for the people, I think the ultimate proof is that in 40 years, no legislator of either party in Iowa has ever introduced a bill to change that system. And you know, we aren't that much different than Iowa. I remember some mayor in Wisconsin once said the only difference between Iowa and Wisconsin and Iowa is we have Milwaukee and they don't. I don't know if that's how accurate or good that is, but we're next door neighbors. So that's the ultimate goal. We win this case and we get the maps redrawn for the 2018 election. That's all terrific. But the end game, I think, still has to be, we believe, is to get to an Iowa plan. They get this out of the hands of the legislators. They shouldn't be able to, as Dale pointed out, guarantee themselves a job. And actually what happens is the minority party, in Wisconsin now it happens to be the Democrats, their seats are even safer than the majority party seats because they've got to stuff as many of the minority party voters in the smallest number of districts possible. So they have even safer seats. The Democrats in Wisconsin are safer than the Republicans. And so they don't have to work with anybody else. They only have to worry about their base and getting reelected. So it's just a bad deal. But I just wanted to mention those 2 things. And I hope in past sessions we've had lots of questions, and we hope we have them tonight. So stop there. And who's first?
And if you just want to stand up and vent, that's all right. I'm sure you'll feel better, and maybe we can add a comment.
Yes.
Can you make the argument that the Supreme Court, people who vote against this, might make in favor of keeping the system?
Sure, I can. It goes like this. The courts have a unique responsibility, and they have to be impartial, and they shouldn't get themselves mired into politics. The Constitution has clearly said this is a responsibility of the legislative branch, and the court ought not be dragged into it. That's been historically the gist of the argument of people who disliked it. But I think the courts have wisely understood in the past that where there are things that really belie the democratic beliefs that we all share, it sometimes means that they have to intervene. And certainly when redistricting has been done to diminish the power of minorities, they have seen fit to speak up. More recently, they have determined that the public is sovereign, and so if your particular state has an initiative referendum, that the legislature cannot block elections or maps that are part of a redistricting effort, as they were in California and Arizona. So they've understood that, and I think the plaintiffs from, I'm not an attorney, and I had to be clear about that for any attorney here in the room. But I think the gist of the plaintiffs is that that we understand the court does believe that there's such a thing as political gerrymandering. In the past, they made the decision they weren't going to rule because there wasn't a standard that they could hang their hat on. Those were Justice Kennedy's words. And so this lawsuit has proceeded with this efficiency gap concept of wasted votes, and hoping that along with other things, will be considered as they make their decision.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It seems to me there's been other things done in addition to redistricting, but like the voter ID laws and the setting primaries in August when students are not they're kind of transitioning
Right.
between jobs in the summer and coming back to school.
The whole topic of voter suppression, which I think fairly encompasses a lot of things. As a legislator who perennially won the campus at Platteville and who represented the campus at his hometown Richland Center, always won that ward as well. I was very concerned about this when my party decided to enter into this stuff, and fought very hard to improve the language as it was put in. Part of the problem with serving in a majority where you have a responsibility to govern is you have to be real with your colleagues. You can't just complain. They're not going to deal with you if they don't think you're going to be helping to pull the train that carries everybody's baggage. That's not perfect, but I think it's a pretty fairly sums up what happens. And on the voter ID law, I voted for it the first time, voted against it the second time. Likewise, each time I tried to improve it. But that, along with the Citizens United and McCutcheon cases, as Tim pointed out, all play together in our elections, and I think are things that ought to be discussed by voters in this state going into the future, because I think our democracy is somewhat in peril.
Also, I think that the August primary, the move from September to August, was not so much a political issue related to students. It was a federal issue. Our primary is one of the latest in the nation. In other words, it's the closest to the general election, I think, maybe of any state in the nation, or maybe tied. And there was issue of it had to do with the military. There was issue of our primary was so late that the general election ballot wasn't getting printed on time to get the soldiers across the world and back for the general election. So I think that was what pushed the August. That wasn't something that the politicians in Wisconsin wanted to have happen for some reason. It was a federal issue. I also, the question on the court.
Did you want to follow up?
Well, no, I think you're getting to that.
Okay.
It's like trying to get a sense for how much does voter suppression contribute to outcome of election compared to redistricting? Is it far more the redistricting than the?
Well, I think I have in the past seen these numbers, so please don't quote me, but I think voter ID laws are in the neighborhood of 1% to 2%. Getting rid of partisan voting, probably 0.5%, something like that. So if you do a whole bunch of things that have marginal impact, you can begin to color the outcome of elections, and then of course when you combine that with redistricting, you could have a pretty potent political advantage.
And the ID law did so many things more than require the ID. And that got all the attention, and they did a good sales job on it. They said, you gotta have a ID to get a book from outside this door here. So what's wrong with having an ID to vote? You know, a lot of people, yeah, that makes sense. And it was like 70% of the state was in favor of that. But below that cover of the ID requirement, which was a real problem in itself, they did a bunch of other things. You used to be able to vote at your place, at your clerk's office until the day before the election. They pushed that back to the previous Friday. They shrunk the time frame for absentee ballots to be cast, and there was about 4 things like that had, and they had IDs had to have. You could use your college ID, but if your college ID didn't have a picture on it, you couldn't use your college ID. And it was just a myriad of things like that. My mother-in-law, she's 94. She's born and raised North Dakota. She stopped driving about 10 years ago. Doesn't have a driver's license. She lives in Janesville. She worked at the polls where she votes for 40 years. You know, everybody knew Kay Mork there at that polling place, but she didn't have an ID. She didn't have didn't keep her driver's license. And my wife, her daughter, when they scrambling, you have to go back and get to the North Dakota, the clerk at the whatever community that she, Jamestown is where she grew up. It just an incredible mess. And she had my daughter her daughter, my wife, keep that straight. Man, I was actually sharp enough to be in the legislature. Trust me. But she, but then it turned out after another election, she was in a home memory care unit actually, and she was able to vote because she was there. But all that kind of stuff, you know. And the thing was that for everybody who had a driver's license, which is probably 80% of the state, it was never a problem. Never. So for the vast majority of people, and I would think a substantial percent of the voting public who vote probably have a driver's license. So it didn't bother almost everybody who had an opinion who voted. It was just a bunch of categories of people. It was categories of people who tended to vote Democrat were the ones that were damaged by the law. But back to the court case for a second. Dale and I, we didn't have enough of these, but we brought along. Dale and I did a column which was in the Washington Post back in June. And what Dale and I decided was we were going to try to influence Justice Kennedy all by ourselves. And so we didn't try to get columns in the Milwaukee Journal or the Wisconsin State Journal or the Stevens Point Journal or whatever. We were trying to get to media that we thought that Supreme Court Justice, particularly Justice Kennedy, and his clerks probably read. So that's why we got the New York Times, we got in the Washington Post, and also we liked it because it makes the case, especially for the league, that this is a bipartisan effort by us, and you're not having someone from just one party here. So we brought some of those along, but that's why we did it. We were trying to figure out how can we influence Justice Kennedy into not having him hear from Republicans that this is just a Democratic plan. And that's, yeah. Anyway, yes, way back there.
Tim used the phrase keeping communities of interest together at the beginning of your presentation. Does that have any bearing in the standard, coming up with a standard?
Well, you get to a key part of this, which I think has to be acknowledged up front, and that is we're not going to end up with maps that are where there are competitive districts all across Wisconsin. There's 99 assembly seats. About 9 or 10 of them are competitive today. Just given where people live and the makeup of people where they live, you can't create 99 competitive districts. You can't come close. But you can do better than 9 or 10. You can do 25 or 30. You can't make a competitive district in Madison. You can't make a competitive district in Milwaukee. You can't make one in Waukesha, Ozaukee, Washington counties that surround Milwaukee. And some other parts of the state, you just can't do it. So the expectation that we're going to have, everybody's going to be going to the polls to vote in a competitive race is not going to happen. But if we can get to 25, I think it would be sort of the way it used to be. And then if you ever get the money under control, we can, because you can win a district that's 55-45, the other party 54-46, if you're a better candidate, you have a better organization, a better message, etc. When I won in 74, I won in a district that was 58% Republican. I ran as a Democrat. Now, I had one big guy helping me that time. I'm forever grateful to him and never had a chance to thank him. His name was Richard M. Nixon. Because 74 was the year of Watergate, and he resigned in August of 74, and even somebody like me was able to win that year. So I never had a chance to thank him, I never had a chance to meet him. But I might not have won that district had it not been the year of Watergate. So big wave elections can overcome a lot of this stuff, but they don't come along that often, and even more so in our angrily divided politics of today. It's pretty hard to imagine 60% victories today. But, yes?
How can the Supreme Court set standards? On what will they base these standards if it's not political? I don't get that.
Well, our case has a standard, which is they measure the number of, when they pack the minority party people into a small number of districts, they call it packing, they count the number of what they call wasted votes in those districts. And then they compare them to the number of Republican weight, in this state, our state would be reverse in Maryland or Rhode Island. Then they count the number of wasted Republican votes in the Republican districts that are drawn up for Republicans. And there's fewer wasted votes there. So they end up with way more wasted votes in the Democratic districts. And so they end up with their mathematics coming up with a number. And it's actually the percent of wasted votes. And in the case, the number that's sort of in the middle that's borderline acceptable is 7%. That if 7% more wasted Democratic votes in Wisconsin than wasted Republican votes, that's borderline acceptable. Every number higher than 7% becomes more and more gerrymandered. We got a 13. It's the highest percent of all the states that so 13% of the votes, more Democratic votes are wasted in Wisconsin than Republican votes. Every number below 7 means that there's less gerrymandered and more competitiveness. 7, 6, 5 is better than 6, 4 is better than 5. 0 is impossible, but you can get somewhere down there. So that's the standard we have, which they can adopt. Or they're the Supreme Court. So they can, if they want to put their clerks and hire some staff or whoever who know this stuff and want to come up with their own standard, that would be up to them. And it's doable. I mean, if you think about it, if these legislatures around the country can find the professionals to gerrymander a map to their advantage, you ought to be able to find professionals who can draw maps that don't favor one party or the other. So it's doable from a technology standpoint.
Have they done that kind of analysis on that one?
Yes.
I don't know what it showed you.
I can't tell you what the numbers are, but I know they've done it for Iowa.
Please repeat his question.
The question was, are there any numbers for Iowa? And the analysis that was done was every state in the nation for like 30 years worth of elections, and we managed to be the top of the list this last time around. So, it's pretty egregious. But I can't tell you the number for Iowa. But my guess is that given what we know about the case for throwing out the system they have, that they were probably somewhere near average the whole way. But
nobody's ever asked us that in 35 meetings. We're in Janesville and Beloit tomorrow night in a combined league meeting like this. I'm going to have that answer by tomorrow night.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But the important thing to understand is that there are mathematicians right now having conferences. I believe there's going to be one in Madison soon where they're going to actually sit down and look at other schemes. There's a lot of interest in this right now. This efficiency gap, or, which relies on wasted votes, isn't the only system, and I think the plaintiffs make that clear, and it's only one element of the lawsuit. And I believe that the court is going to have to hang its hat on something, so it's likely, just again, not a legal opinion, just what I would think common sense is if they pick one, it will likely be the one that we're offering. But as long as there was some standard that was generally agreed upon, I think people would look favorably on their decision, and they could defend it. And I think one of the most important points in the lawsuit is the Supreme Court is the only institution that can fix this, because once somebody has the power, they have no incentive to correct something because it's contrary to their self-interest. So the public really needs this balanced approach that we have in our democracy of three separate and equal branches of government, and this is the Supreme Court's opportunity to stand up and play their constitutional role. We had, we'll take one over here.
So you mentioned that the goal of these legislators is to avoid primaries, and if there is a challenge, it's usually to the right of the right or the left of the left.
Did anybody see the comments of Mr. Bannon in California? Whoa, well that's the brave new future if we don't change this, and that'll be on the right and on the left.
That's my question. What does the gerrymandered map, I mean, how does that come into play? Does that just mean the fight happens in, for example, if it's a Republican-controlled
I'll let you
area,
talk for a little bit.
the fight happens in the primary, and if you don't agree with that, if it ends up being further right, then once that decision is made in the primary, it goes through in the election.
I'm not quite sure. I'm sorry, did I get what your question is?
And just, this whole fractioning within the Republican Party with Bannon and generating these candidates that are even further,
Yeah.
well, I haven't heard the left thing, but further right. How does that play in here, or doesn't it?
Well, how it plays in here is that the more competitive districts we have, the incumbent cannot just pander to their base. They'll lose the general election. They have to work with people who they disagree with. They have to vote somewhere in some moderate way that reflects the majority opinion of their district, not just the majority opinion of those who would show up in a primary. That's what this is trying to do. Now, the Republicans try to, I know I could hear by the noise that a lot of you followed what Bannon's doing. They tried a Bannon-like effort a few years ago, back in 12 or 14. They did it I remember they did it in Missouri, they did it in Indiana, and they did it in another state in the East Coast. I think. Nebraska. And maybe even Nevada, I'm not sure. But they ran in their primaries far-right candidates who won Republican primaries and then lost the general elections, 3 or 4 of them. The Republicans would have taken over the U.S. Senate that year had their being sort of viewed as moderate Republican incumbent not been knocked out in the primary by some people who were way over there. So this Bannon effort, without Bannon, I don't know, he may have had something to do with that, but it wasn't as publicly known across the nation and centered on one person. There was, yes.
Getting back to the point you were making about the Supreme Court is the only entity that can actually rule and change this. You were getting back to you were proposing that we go to the Iowa system. How do we do that when we know that the legislature, that Wisconsin, the legislature, the governorship, and the courts are all Republicans? Why would they change it to that system?
Well, I don't think they will the way it is now. but the Supreme Court rules the way we hope they rule, and then the maps are more competitive, and the races are more competitive, and the legislative results reflect the overall opinion of Wisconsin in any given election. So, but It's not gonna be easy, but none of this stuff usually is. It's just we're going to have to keep pushing to have, and I gotta stay alive, and he's gotta stay alive, and we gotta keep pushing to have it happen. But you make a very good point. It's not, this legislature today is not gonna adopt the Iowa plan. They wouldn't even have a hearing on
It's
it.
going to be public opinion if they rule, if the Supreme Court rules in our favor. It's going to be public opinion that pushes for, say, the Iowa.
Public opinion and competitive districts. I think that's a possibility. Right behind you, there was a woman there. Yes.
Yes, I have a question on the individual votes. Do they actually know? I thought this is a private vote when you vote. You're saying that they know?
No.
Like this household is Republican and this household is Democratic?
Well, they don't know how you voted. They don't have access to the poll results, obviously. But they know what kind of car you drive. They know where you go on vacation. You know what magazines you read. And they know this and this and this, and what stores you go to. And they create a composite of you. And that composite says you're more than likely than not, you're going to vote Republican or Democrat based on all of these things they can figure out about you. You know, where you use your credit card. I mean, what can be found out about us now is scary beyond belief to me.
Stand to privacy.
I've started just paying cash. I think that's
Going off grid. Yeah, I would just come, it's all predictive is the point. Remember, this lawsuit, it was filed with the idea that it diminished the value of the plaintiff's votes. In other words, their votes didn't matter anymore. If you pack enough people into an area, they don't really get to choose anything. If they're if they're a guaranteed minority in a vote, they aren't choosing anybody. So that's the theory behind the lawsuit. And what I think most people are really trying to make certain happens is that citizens pick their politicians. Politicians aren't picking their voters. And with this composite sketch of everybody, they can predict what people are going to do with startling accuracy, and it's getting more and more accurate. They don't have to knock on your door and ask you who you're going to vote for. Well, they'll still do that, and that's still going to happen, but they have all these other tools that can refine the targeting, and that's the scary part about it, and people have figured it out. You know, people say, I don't vote because the whole thing's rigged. I had a late elder brother who used to say it just encourages the bastards. And I'm beginning to think he might have had something on me for a long time. No, this is very new, and I think for those of us who are old enough to have watched the birth of the computer revolution and information age in our society, we realize things are very different, and some things are good and some things are not so good.
Talk about the precision just for a second. When the Republicans drew these maps in 2011, the professionals who used all these analytics to draw the map, they asked them, after they'd drawn the map, to pick out some districts. In Assembly District 31, what percent of the vote? They're asking this in the summer of 2011 about an election that's going to occur in November of 2012. He said, in this district that you've just drawn, what's the likely percent that the Republican candidate is going to get next year in the 2012 election? And they called those, and we found this out through a second federal lawsuit filed in Milwaukee. Was a racial gerrymandering issue involving the same map. That court got this information. They predicted within 1% the results that occurred 15 months later, 16 months later in November of 2012. That's how precise they were. They knew what they were doing. And they said their person's going to win 58-42, and they won 58.2 to 41.8 or whatever. They were within 1% of calling it. So they knew what they were doing. Yes?
Just to comment.
Yes.
When all the points that were brought up, it adds up to a very sad situation. This is a total takedown of democracy. It's a suppression. Instead of people voting and having a right, which you should be, regardless of what party you belong to, this is all game. And that's the bad part. And so it makes me wonder Can we ever correct the situation?
Well,
The Supreme Court has that power.
the Supreme Court has the power in the next few months to do it. And if they send it back, they agree in this, and they then this.
That's what I'm getting at,
Hmm?
right?
Yeah.
That's my point.
That's why Tim started out saying it's about rigging elections. Gerrymandering is a nice word. It's really about rigging elections. And you know what? Democrats and Republicans both do it. That does not make it okay.
It's about power.
And I give you credit, Mr. Bratz, for standing up. Your character showed through when you voted, you were Republican, and you voted for, you made the right choice at the end. Where you and your friend voted together or thought together about what's taking place in this country, in the state of Wisconsin. I give you credit for that.
Thank you.
Yes, I see one hand over here. Yes.
So if the courts go with the standard of wasted votes, which is one of the things that was put forward that we've been talking about tonight, doesn't that mean that people still need to vote and have wasted votes for them to be able to tell how many have been wasted, so that they know that the procedure isn't working the way they want it? So it doesn't seem like that standard is going to get us where we need to be very quickly. Because they're setting the district lines every 10 years, or would they change them every year if they find out that they're wasted every 2 years, or for the midterm elections, or whatever?
Well, unless a court orders something, there's only going to be the lines drawn every 10 years. First of all, that's not going to change. When you draw a map, it's all about motive. You know, what's the motive of the map drawer? And the motive on this map, on the Illinois and Wisconsin maps over here, the motive was to give a partisan advantage to one political party, the one in power. But if you take it away from that motive to the motive has to be to create as many competitive districts as possible, then you get to where I think we all want to get. I don't know if we're ever going to be able to go back and see, if somebody's vote was wasted in 2012 and 14 and 16, is it still wasted? I mean, we're never going to get to an individual. What we're going to see is, what the ultimate is always, is look at the top of the ticket. If in 2012, Obama wins Wisconsin with 52 or 53% of the vote, generally speaking, you would think if there wasn't rigging of the elections, the legislature results would be probably pretty close. Republicans could even had a narrow majority, but it would have been pretty close. And more often than not, probably the Democrats would have had a narrow majority because they carried the statewide. 2014, Governor Walker's the top of the ticket. He wins with 52%. You think the legislative results ought to be somewhat close. They weren't. They were 64-35, I think, or 65-34 Republican in the Assembly. 2016 is practically a tie. Trump wins by 22,000 votes statewide, and the Assembly actually picks up a vote, and it's now 65-34 Republican. So that'll be the ultimate way that citizens can kind of measure whether we made a lot of progress, is the legislative results ought to a significant degree, but not exactly reflect the mood of the voters of the statewide. And how do they vote for U.S. Senate, how do they vote for governor, how do they vote for president.
That concept is called symmetry. In other words, whatever the picture of the statewide vote ought to be reflected within the legislature. If in the last 3 elections, average between them, this state's like less than 1%, more Republican than Democrat, which would lead one to believe that the legislature should be very close, like 50-49. But it's not. And symmetry is a measure of the whole state, and obviously the districts are drawn. People do live where they want to live, and sometimes that means there's a clustering of one political party in a community or another, and that's natural. So you're not going to have perfect symmetry. But when it gets totally out of whack, then we have to sort of begin to question, is there something else going on here? That's really what the point of the lawsuit is, that there's been so much gerrymandering that the picture is totally out of whack, and this whole concept of the efficiency gap, again, is a mathematical way of measuring how bad things are. And you shouldn't look at it as anything but that. I know it's kind of in the weeds, but it's important. Well, I'm getting more questions, not less. We should talk, we'd have everybody talk less, we'd have everybody satisfied.
Are you good to keep going?
Sure,
Okay.
sure.
Go ahead.
Did this case involve the U.S. congressional districts, or was it specifically focused on the state legislature?
Just the state assembly. Now, if you fix the state assembly, because there's 3 assembly seats in every state senate seat, you fix the state senate. But it's not anything to do with Congress. And that's a whole other story, which...
That also was gerrymandering.
Well, yes, but for a different reason, and you're not going to like this one either. At least I don't. We have 8 congressmen. What's been going on, we used to have 10, and 8, 9, now 8. What's been going on, at least since the 70s that I'm familiar with, is that the senior Republican congressman from Wisconsin, which has been Jim Sensenbrenner from down in the Milwaukee area for quite a while, and the senior Democrat, which was Dave Obey for a long time, now it's Ron Kind, who turns out is your congressman now too. Interesting how he got here, which is the rest of the story. What they've done out there, our congressional delegation for at least going on 50 years, they draw the maps for incumbent protection regardless of party. That's how they've done it for almost 50 years. I know since the 70s. And so what that means is that we now have today in Wisconsin 8 congressional seats. In the 2016 election, none were closer than 20 points. Every one of them was 60-40 or more. And one of the there are 2 key, some of the seats are safe just by where people live. But in 2001, there were these 2 bright young Congress people who got elected in 1998. Paul Ryan in the 1st district and Tammy Baldwin in the 2nd district, down in the southeastern part of the state in Madison and Kenosha. The first time they run for re-election, Tammy almost gets beat. Really a terrific candidate, Republican faculty member from UW-Madison takes her on, almost beats her. She gets less than 52% of the vote. And Paul Ryan wins by more than that, but had a weaker candidate for an opponent. So the 2 leaders get together in 2001, and they draw a map that helps out Republican Ryan and Democrat Baldwin. How they did it was the city of Beloit. City of Beloit, which I represented myself in the state senate, heavily Democratic city. Ryan doesn't want to represent Beloit. It's 62 to 65% Democrat. Tammy Baldwin would love to represent Beloit. She had these rural counties outside of Madison that were voting against her. So what they did was they took, sort of the way they got Ron Kind over here, they took a narrow strip down the west side of Rock County, sometimes only a township wide, got her around Janesville because Paul was from Janesville. He didn't want to give up his hometown. So he didn't want to give up Janesville, but he was willing to give up Beloit. And they ran her district, the 2nd district, around Janesville down to the bottom of the state to pick up Beloit, which got her a whole lot of Democratic votes. Like I say, it's first time I ran, I got 73% of Beloit. She gets Beloit, and she gets rid of the rural Republican counties they were voting against her. She gets Beloit. Paul Ryan gets rid of Beloit. What do they give him to replace Beloit? Southern Waukesha County. Now, if you love gerrymandering, you can't think of a better trade than Beloit for Southern Waukesha County if you're a Republican. Made them both safe. They were never challenged again in any serious way. 2010 comes. Sean Duffy replaces Dave Obey. And Ron Kine had had some competitive races, but his 3rd district was always a Mississippi River district. Just ran all the way down the west side of the state from Eau Claire to the state line. Duffy doesn't want to represent you folks here, unfortunately, or Portage County. So what do? The 2 senior congressmen get together and they make them both safer. They run Ron Kine right across the state in a narrow strip from La Crosse all the way over here to get Portage County. And he's got a county, I don't know, it's a county north
St.
of
Croix.
St. Croix, county north of Eau Claire that's very Republican. Kine gets rid of the Republican county, gives it to Duffy. Duffy gets rid of Stevens Point. And Kine doesn't even have a Republican opponent the next election. In 2016 he didn't, and Duffy's a lot safer. So it's just as bad for democracy, but the motive is different. The motive is to protect the incumbents. And the leadership of both parties has played the game for 50 years. But it's not part of our case. It's not right, but it's not part of our case. Somebody hasn't asked a question. Did you ask?
What organization is sponsoring the plaintiff's case and how are they funded?
The name of the organization is the Fair Elections Project, which we are like the honorary co-chairs of. We don't get paid or anything like that, but it's
We're not?
You haven't got checks?
No.
But then they found a law firm in Chicago that does civil rights work pro bono, and they took the case. And so we've got some really terrific lawyers. And then when the Supreme Court took the case, they hired a fellow named Smith who had practiced in front of the Supreme Court a lot to be our lead lawyer. But they've done it all pro bono. So the Fair Elections Project has some costs in terms of expert witnesses and stuff like that. And they take money, but Dale and I don't get any of it. But there is some cost. We had to have expert witnesses when we had the trial in Madison last May. But it's called Fair. You go to fairelectionsproject.org and find out about them. Yes?
When the Supreme Court ruled that the districts had to be exactly the same size and population of their code, did that give a big leap to gerrymandering? Because you used to have districts that more closely followed established political lines. You tended to stay, counties tended to stay together. The townships weren't split up. But once they did that, they had the big leap that, we got to do it to do this. And so then it became easier to justify a gerrymander.
I think that you can make a case that gerrymandering is an unintended consequence of that. But what had happened was, from 1910, and this was true in Wisconsin and probably other states, from 1910 to 1960, including 1961, the Wisconsin legislature never reapportioned itself for 50 years. If you think of 2 world wars and the Depression and all the movement of people off the farm into the cities for manufacturing jobs, et cetera, you had these rural areas which were way overrepresented in the legislature. You had urban districts that had twice as many people as the rural districts. And the Supreme Court finally said, that's not fair either. And there was the case Baker versus Carr in 1963, which said one person, they said one man, one vote. I would hope today they'd say one person, one vote. And that was why the Wisconsin legislature then actually reapportioned in 1963, was forced to by the court. But I don't know that, that was before the computer. I don't think they ever thought ahead. They were solving a problem, which...
I agree with that. I just think that now they've been using that case as a fig leaf to justify some of this splitting they're doing.
Well, I would say it's less justifying it. It's more providing more opportunities for us. I think that's really what's happened. But the big change is not that we have to do it every 10 years. We could do it and do it fairly and give the power to the people. But that's not the way the system works. Right now we use technology to thwart the will of the people, and it makes it easier and easier as technology gets better and better. Yeah.
Yes.
You had mentioned the Wisconsin Counties Association, and we went even farther. We have a township our township that we live in. We passed a resolution saying that we want nonpartisan drawing of the maps. if this doesn't pass the Supreme Court, you know the legislators down in Madison much better than I do. Are any of them going to listen to any of us when we do things like that?
You know, one of the most shocking things for me in this experience that Tim and I have shared, and it really has been a labor of love. No, we don't get paid. We don't even get expenses. We don't want them. We are doing this because we both had wonderful opportunities and really believe in the process. But perhaps the most shocking thing, to continue my thought, for me, is being in a room like this and having somebody stand up and say, what are we going to do? Our legislators tell us we can't touch them. And you know what, Dale? They're right. Nothing makes me sadder. Then you sit around and try to figure out, give them some advice, tell them, well, why don't you run a primary against them, even if you're of the opposite political party, just to make their life miserable. You know, look, I think all of us learn in civics that, you know, the will of the people is the most important thing, and we respect that, and the process ought to respect that. And no, do I think the majorities, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, whatever, fixed this? No. When Jim Doyle was governor, I know personally many Democrats who urged him to provide leadership and do redistricting reform, and he said no because the Democrats always thought they'd be in charge. And you go to Republicans now and you get the same attitude. The courts have to play their historic role, I'm afraid. What happens, you know, this scheme, efficiency standard, is one way to do it. You could have an Iowa model, you could have commissions, bipartisan commissions. There's a lot of different methodologies that can be used, but the important point is the courts have to take some power away from the legislature to prevent them from corrupting the system.
Well, I think the other answer is that big problems sometimes take a long time. Women met in Seneca Falls in 1848 to try to get the right to vote, and they got it in 1920. It took them 72 years. I was watching University of Alabama football game for a while Saturday night, and here are tens of thousands and tens of thousands of white Alabama citizens cheering the African-American quarterback for the University of Alabama. I can't imagine when I was young that the University of Alabama would have an African-American quarterback, and certainly they didn't think they would ever have an African-American quarterback. So, and on and on. It took the Supreme Court to desegregate the public schools in 1954. So an awful lot of the great progress in this country has actually come from the courts. A lot of the civil rights stuff and a lot of that stuff has come from the courts. So we live in an age of more instant gratification, and we like to get, because we can do almost everything in an instant and find out information in an instant. But this one may take a while, because you're absolutely right. This legislature today is, like I said, wouldn't even give a hearing to Dale and I on our bill to switch the Iowa system. But I believe we'll get there, because we just see bigger crowds, more interested crowds than we did a few years ago. And all the townships and the counties that are acting, they can get away with it for a while. And they may get away with it, but ultimately, the public usually wins. So I hope that's true. Yes?
Should we take one or two more questions?
And you haven't asked a question, have you?
No.
I don't think. I'm sorry.
Let's be optimistic for a second, say that the Supreme Court does recognize the gerrymandering in Wisconsin as a severe case and one that must be stopped. What would be the procedure from there? Would they recommend then an independent commission that's established to redistrict, or do you have an idea of where we would go from there?
Well, I always have to preface it with the Supreme Court can do whatever it wants. But the presumption is they would affirm the decision of the three-judge panel in Wisconsin, that in fact our maps are unconstitutional. And they'd send it back to the three-judge panel they could direct some other remedy. The likely remedy of the three-judge panel will be to send the map notice to the Wisconsin legislators to say, this is the Supreme Court decision, this is the standard they've set, you redraw these maps according to the standards that the Supreme Court has said is the law of the land, and do it in a very timely fashion. I think they'll just be all over their case. How can you be a federal judge, rule a map unconstitutional, and let another election be held under an unconstitutional map? So give them a short string, get a map redrawn, and then if they don't come back and beat the standard that's set by the court, they will probably give it to a federal judge to draw. That's what's been done before. That's my guess is the pattern. So unless the Supreme Court decides something different than that, which I can't predict.
Or in the interest of time, they could ask both sides to submit a map, and then they would decide between the two maps, or they would make a hybrid of the two maps. They've done that before. Way in the back.
The latest issue of Mother Jones had a 7-page article on voter suppression, basically on voter ID. Estimate 45,000 people in the state did not vote for that. About half of them in Madison and Milwaukee. They had people going to DMV offices, 11 of them, and only 3 of them could give them a voter ID within 1 week. 4 groups that were most affected, they figured were black people, college students, young people, and first-time voters. Sounds about right. Very good article.
Yeah, they got it nailed. One last question.
What is the one thing we can personally do to help get the Supreme Court to rule to protect us from this gerrymandering?
Well, as Tim said, we were crazy enough to start that we could actually influence the Supreme Court, and I would sort of use that as a guide all the way along. All we say is we invite you to be crazy enough to make an effort to do one more thing or 2 more things before a decision is handed down. Letters to the editors, letters to the justices. No, the justices are not going to read all of our letters, but they've got aides who are going to measure the mail. So emailing, snail mail, whatever, letters to the editor, a letter, particularly to an East Coast newspaper that's likely to be read by those law clerks, and even locally to keep the issue alive. This is about education. Democracy is hard work. I know you know that, or you wouldn't be League of Women Voter members, or you wouldn't be here tonight. And we just have to resolve ourselves to do the right thing. So I think that's a great question. It's a great question to end on.
I did one thought on it, which is several of you individually send letters to the Washington Post and talk about the township that passed, a small township in the middle of Wisconsin passed a resolution that the Wisconsin Counties Association, hardly a Democratic-leaning organization statewide, is endorsed this change. And I think the Washington Post would like to have some of those letters from just good old citizens from Wisconsin who cared enough to write them a letter. And I know for a fact that the Washington Post is delivered at Justice Kennedy's office every morning. I know that for a fact. Thank you very much.